Hi, everyone. Thank you, Francesca, for agreeing to do this. So what we're going to do today is 3 rounds of questions. This is a follow-up to our book launch a few weeks ago. We're going to do 3 rounds of questions with questions that you've submitted before, that you wrote on the chat. So you really wanted to get to all of them. And Francesca has been kind and generous enough with their time to agree to do that. So we're going to start with the first topic, which is the divine. And we have 3 questions for Francesca about the divine. So the first one is from Maria Marta Fernandez, and they would like to know more about the place of the sacred in posthumanism and which meditation from your book, Francesca, so which meditation they should start with if they want to learn more about your thoughts on the divine. A second question is by Tijan T, and they comment that posthuman entanglements and oneness, that this resonates with ancient and medieval spiritual texts, for example, Sufi and Kabbalah text, the Bhagavad Gita in Hindu, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And they say that those teachings are also non-anthropocentric. And the question is, could we say that pre-modern societies were more posthuman than modern societies? And on a similar note, Jessica Vishpu asks about shamanism in specific, and about how you, Francesca, incorporate shamanism when taking into account your own view of the posthuman, if you draw on theoretical frameworks to explore it, or if you draw on your own personal experiences and spiritual experiences. So those are our 3 questions, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for organizing this Q&A session. The book launch was amazing. There was so much energy, so many interesting insights, so much joy about being together and reflecting together on a very special day. We did celebrate on Valentine's, February 14, 2024, in the sense of loving existence, the way it is, the way we are and the way they are, non-dual appreciation of post-anthropocentric love. And so when we were ending the meeting, we were left with this sense of joy and excitement, and with all these waves of questions that were really, really fascinating. So Manuel and Ines, who is really kindly editing these videos for us, and I thought that it would be maybe nice to be together again to address all these important topics. And so thank you so much, everyone, for posting your questions and for bringing such important questions to all of us. We divided them in 3 sections, and we are now addressing the divine, starting with this, then we're going to address the child, and then we're going to address the environment. So the sacred, and thank you so much. This was for Maria Fernandez, is that correct? Maria Fernanda. Thank you so much for asking this question, the sacred. I think that the sacred is the cream, the sublime, the moment of joy and bliss of our lives. And it is a very personal experience. It is when we realize that we are no longer just something specific. We are no longer just a child, or just a human, or just a tree, or just a laptop, or just anything you want, something close, something separated, something different from everything else in a ontological dichotomy, so separated that we cannot connect. Once that illusion dissolves, then the sacred starts. And then everything can be sacred. From the way we brush our teeth, to the way we walk to the supermarket, to the way we write our novels, to the way we treat others. And so I would say that the sacred is really, can become our daily ritual, our nightly ritual, our dreams, our awareness. And so in that sense, I would say that probably the posthuman, conceived as a post humanist, which means realizing that the human is many, that the species is many. There is no one species that can be simplified in one single entity, unless you think this as a collective body, for instance, the body of a species. And then when you think of post-anthropocentrism, so really understanding that we do not need to be mastering anything, we need to enjoy our existence, because that's the reason why we're here. Why would we be living if we are not enjoying our lives? And so we understand that anthropocentrism not only is no longer suiting us as a species, actually anthropocentric habits are the cause of our risk of extinction. For instance, climate change, ecological disaster are based on this misunderstanding of who we are as a species, because the human is not separated from non-human species. The human is not separated from the environment, and so on. And then if you add to this the third understanding that I believe is fundamental to have a post-human awareness is post-dualism. Realizing that the illusion of being completely separated is actually an existential obfuscation. It's actually not real. It's actually a wrong perception. What, for instance, in Hindu or Buddhist tradition is called either samsara in Buddhism or, for instance, Maya in Hindu cosmologies. So once we realize that we really aren't completely separated, then we understand that is a big cosmic gain, that we are here because we want to be here. It's not easy to be born. Think of all the energy and even pain that goes into someone being born out of another body. So it is not easy to be here. So why are we here? And one of the answers that, for instance, Hindu cosmologists give, specifically Advaita Vedanta's one, are, I think, a very good answer. And it's Satchitananda. Satchitananda. So Sat would be existence. Chit would be consciousness. And Ananda, something that we often forget in our daily experience of anxiety for small things, like, oh, wow, I lost the bus again, or, oh, wow, where are my keys? In those moments of small anxiety, we forget about bliss, which is a very interesting notion that comes in this idea of Satchitananda. That's who we are. And so I would say that the sacred really helps us to reconnect with our own understanding of the self. Once the self, that is who we are, is understood as the others within. So the sacred, thank you again, Maria Fernanda, for asking this question, I believe is at the core of our personal social ethics once we know who we are. And so from here, Manuel, maybe we could go to the second question, if you don't mind, maybe rereading that, so it's fresh both for me and for the audience.
Yes. So the second question is by Tijan T. And they comment that the posthuman entanglements and oneness resonate with ancient and medieval spiritual texts, which is something that you were just talking about, right? For example, Sufi and Kabbalah texts, the Bhagavad Gita in Hindu, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And they say that these teachings are non-anthropocentric and ask, so the question is, could we say that pre-modern societies were more post-human than modern societies?
What a great question. I think it's brilliant. And I really think that allow us as academics to open a whole chapter that has been obscured by the shades of misunderstanding, which is the so-called Middle Ages. That is, for instance, considered, going on for at least 1,000 years. It is usually considered something that is based on at least in the Western history. I cannot generalize here, because, for instance, in Islam, during the Middle Ages, you have really the acme of Islamic societies. And so it's not to be generalized, but there are areas of this planet, I'm thinking, for instance, of Western history, where the Middle Ages are represented as something based on the ignorance, in ignorance of who we are, wars, losing perception of reality, at least the way I studied it. Might be different now. But that's the way I was presented. And I did study, you know, some years of history. And Middle Ages are usually, at least in Italy, I would say, in Europe, presented as the Dark Ages, the Dark Ages. And so it's very interesting because I wasn't particularly drawn to them because of the way I was presented it growing up. And then at one point I was asking if I wanted to teach medieval philosophies. And at first there was a reaction. Oh no, I rather do, you know, ancient or contemporary. And then I was like, why do I have this reaction? This is such a big chunk of time. There is so much going on. For instance, non-dual Advaita Vedanta is born at the same time. Adi Shankara arrives at the same time. A lot of Buddhist tradition. And then, you know, and then I started to look again into Christianity. And then I started to look again into all these other traditions that were silencing this idea of the Dark Ages. And I realized that throughout these at least 1,000 years, throughout planet Earth, there were major experience of mysticism, from Christian tradition to Islamic tradition to Jewish tradition, Buddhism, Hinduism. Mysticism was not only happening, but was recognized socially. It was considered something possible, something that can happen, not only that can happen, but that is special, that is revered, that is beautiful, that is unique, that very pure souls can get there. And in order to do that, you need to work on yourself. Think of the whole monastic tradition throughout so many different cultures and religions. And so I kind of really opened my heart, and I realized I started to read all these mystics from the Middle Ages, coming from all different traditions, from Rumi to Teresa of Avila to Kabbalah, so much going on. And I realized that during this, at least what is considered the European Middle Ages, which is at least 1,000 years, the mystic union of the sacred was considered something possible. And many people were claiming to experience that, to say, I perceive that. This is not just some illusion, the idea that we are part of everything. At the time, many traditions would call it God, but you really don't have even to call it God. If God became something that in our tradition, in our contemporary world becomes, you know, something that makes people scared. Oh God, I don't want to deal with that. If that is the reaction, don't call it God, call it energy, call it, you know, comprehensiveness, call it whatever you want. But this idea that there is this final connection where this union of the micro and the macro is happening, is the spark, is that allow for existence to happen. That during the Middle Ages, so-called Middle Ages, throughout the planet Earth was recognized. And it is such a gift to humankind, recognizing that that is not only possible, but is happening. It is revered. And think, for instance, of all the beautiful tradition of Sufi poems based on the mystical understanding of Allah as this universal love, talking again about the love that we were mentioning, the love for existence, not the appropriation that sometimes is misunderstood, romantic love, or not the sense of possessiveness, not that. A love that opens up, not a love that closes. That is not love, it is an attachment. But the love that opens us, the love that allows us to understand that we are that there is never a final disconnection. And so the Middle Ages were really great times to not only experience that, but to voice in a way that people would have understood that, would not have laughed, would not have said science does not prove that, would not have said, who are you to say that? Would have been silence, would have been the work, for instance, of the monastics in all traditions, of many traditions that support monastic lives, was the understanding that you don't need to use words to explain what it is. So think of the long silent retreats in all these traditions, from Tibet to Portugal. Think of really like the way religion was conceived as a discipline of the self, not just something that you do because it's part of your culture, but something become your life. Some of these people would live between it become a society to become part of a monastery. Of course, the monastery was part of the economics of society. Actually, economics start from monasteries going back to ancient Sumeria. So religion is at the core of human society. And it is true that in these last 200 years since the death of God, according to Nietzsche, we've come to realize that, that religion has also been an imposition in some societies, where it's no longer a choice. So obviously mysticism never talks about that it's imposed upon you, cannot be that. This understanding, this final understanding of the self cannot be imposed by anyone, but it is raising from you. It's called the inner guru. It is the inner call. It is the inner flame, the inner light, all the inner darkness. Once you understand the darkness is not bad, but it is the space expanding. And in all the ancient societies, the dark was considered the positive, the regeneration of life, the humus. So yes, we could say that pre-modern societies, on some levels, had a deep posthuman understanding. Now, I would also say that posthumanism, it is also raising at a specific time. Actually, I would say at a specific point in space-time, a specific point that when planet Earth is the way it is. Think of the Anthropocene. Think the way the planet is right now, which is different from the way it was, for instance, in year 2000, according to the Common Era. There are different, for instance, trees. I am right now based in the United States. And if I was here 1,000 years ago, the vegetation would look very different, because with the settlers, a lot of different seeds came, a lot of different animals came, a lot of the original forests were cut down to use it for woods. So it is, on some level, the planet itself has evolved. And we have evolved as a species. So I would say that there are definitely a lot of understanding that are deeply posthumanist. Of course, the question is, can we think of posthumanism as an atemporal understanding? And I would probably say something like post-dualism. So it's like going beyond the illusion of Maya. That is definitely post-temporal. I think that understanding goes beyond any space and time, and it goes beyond any species. And it really relates of the deepest existential awareness is going back at the core of the flame of existence. Why do we exist? And we don't have to exist as humans. We could exist as stones or as AI or as the sun. So yes, there are a lot of understandings that can be defined as posthumanist in pre-modern societies. And we could define those societies as posthuman. I would just recommend, if you, for instance, are maybe thinking and interested in writing on these topics, which I highly recommend, I would say to make sure that in your introduction, you clarify your take on posthuman. And then you really clarify the openness of something like, for instance, post-dualism. And it is also very interesting, to finalize this answer, that a lot of groups of people that at the time were silenced because of different type of human biases. I'm thinking, for instance, of slavery in many different parts of the world. I'm thinking, for instance, of sexism, which was real in different nations and areas. So during those times, for instance, there are a lot of female mystics. There are a lot of non-white mystics. And so this is really, to me, such an important message that no one can silence the final understanding, not even a disease. Sometimes people say, oh, all people who get Alzheimer's, poor people, they don't understand who they are. And I would highly argue with that. I had a grandmother who was very special, but she also used to be concerned a lot about things. And so she would complain a lot, she would be concerned a lot, she was angry a lot. And eventually she got really old and started to forget things. And all of a sudden she became much calmer. And she became, to me, much happier. And eventually when she started to get really old and really forgetting most of, like things that people think are important, like my name, she was really peaceful. She was moneyed out. She was fine. And I remember thinking, wow, she actually is doing really good on some level. Of course, maybe for the people of the family, the fact that she doesn't remember your name, that your ego gets touched, oh, she doesn't remember my name. But how is she doing, apart from not remembering your name? And I cannot generalize here, but I would say that some people do fine without having this memory of close history. And so I would say that I'm bringing this example to say that there are species, for instance, who don't have a big brain. So some people say, oh, they don't have consciousness. And that is very human-centric. To exist, there must be some form of awareness. Does not have to be human awareness, obviously, and that is where the shaman, the shamanistic societies come in, telling us the shaman is the one, and I say more with the accent that is more Russian, because shaman come from languages that are based on what is nowadays called Russia. And the shaman is the one who is transspecies. And this is, for instance, how Eduardo Viveiros de Castro defines the shaman. In Amerindian societies and all the human societies at the beginning of our history are shamanistic, all throughout the Paleolithic time are shamanistic. And in the shaman is the one who doesn't see the human as something that separates the human from the other species, but see themselves as transspecies, see themselves as in dialogue with all beings. Forget about living or not living. Can be a stone, can be a mushroom, can be a planet. And so I know that there is a third and last question of this group of questions about shamanistic groups and of understanding of existence. So why don't we go to that question, Manuel?
Yes, that would be wonderful. So we have our last question is by Jessica Bispo, and she is asking about shamanism, as you said. And she wants to know how you incorporate shamanism in your work when taking into account your view of the posthuman. So if you draw on theoretical frameworks to explore it, or if instead, and depending on how comfortable you feel sharing about this, if you draw on your own personal and spiritual experiences.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for such an important question. And thank you so much, Manuel, for bringing the question to all of us. It is very important to remember that when we study, between little commas, about the human, in many societies, we really study about 1% of our history. We do not study almost anything about 99% of our history. And this is something that I would highly recommend everyone, if you are actually watching this because you're reading the Art of Being Posthuman, to read the chapter 2 on this, which is all about prehistory, so-called prehistory. And so the prehistoric times that are pretty much the Paleolithic time with a small chunk of the Neolithic time. That's when we are starting to see society as it is right now, with urbanity starting to develop, with borders starting to develop, with some forms of writing starting to develop. Of course, later on, we're going to see the official writing in Mesopotamia. And so throughout all these times that we don't study, there are incredible archives that are, for instance, cave paintings. And throughout these other forms of archives, we understand that the human had shamanistic beliefs. What does this mean? It means that the human was really conceived as part as everything else. The human had deep understanding of all the species around them, of all the plants around them, of the geography of their land. Why is that? Because the humans at the time, actually the humans for most of our time, and some humans are still nowadays nomadic. They were moving around. They were not just living in a settlement. Or you can say that they were living in moving settlements. And so if you are moving to different areas, often cyclically, so you're coming back to the same areas. Sometimes if you think of the journey out of Africa, you can think of these species, many human species at the time, eventually thousands of years after thousands of years, eventually leaving Africa without really realizing that. So yes, you can say it's almost like planet Earth is moving around the sun and the sun is moving in orbiting, and everything is moving in cycles, but it's also moving in space. So yes, they are moving in the similar trajectories, but they're also moving away, like the universe is expanding. So the same goes with humans, the nomadic movement. They were, like moving in specific geometries, often as a cycle, of course, based on the weather as well, and on resources, which obviously at the time were not considered resources, because the human was considered as part of everything else. So in these amazing, for instance, cave paintings that we have many examples of, some are, for instance, close to you, Manuel, in Spain, La Pasiega caves. And so we see these non-human animals that are drawn perfectly from different perspectives. And some people would claim, well, they were having this knowledge because of hunting. But even the notion of hunting, it is very different. It's not like nowadays having a rifle and going and killing all the animals. These people were running with the animals. They were getting exhausted with the animals. We know that genetically we expanding so much our possibility of the marathons. The beginning of the marathons come from human running, after animals, and eventually getting the animal exhausted because they could not expel their suitors because they had a lot of hair. And so we understand that the human could not conceive themselves in separation, because if they did, they would starve to death. For instance, if I move around cyclically and I go to an area and I cut all the trees, all the, let's say, for instance, olive trees, since you are in a beautiful Mediterranean area, and I cut all the trees and I make a big fire, a big ceremony. But then when I come back, let's say 6 months later, or even sometimes 1 year later, there are no trees left. There is no shadow, which was fundamental. There is no fruit. There is no oil, and so on and on and on. So we understand that at this point in our history, which is 99%, and I really want to underline this because no one knows. It is incredible how we really erase part of our history, which I think shows in our a big existential obfuscation of our own age. We were just running towards what? Towards the end of our life. And so, if we step back and instead of just running through all these things, try to really understand our history, we understand that most likely we are still here because we were at peace with our own existence. We knew who we were. I'm not saying, I cannot generalize. I'm not saying that people were happy at the time or anything like that. It's not about happiness, but is it about understanding that if we cut all the trees of planet Earth, the first ones to die are us. If we keep doing what we're doing, extracting, and eventually there is nothing else to extract, we are killing our macro body, the planet, because we are the planet. We're not just living on the planet. And so I would say that this shamanistic understanding of the human is not only the longest understanding of who we are, but it's still going on through all the continents. All traditional societies are shamanistic everywhere, from Italy to Morocco, to India, to Saudi Arabia, through the Andes. And in that, I would like to bring this topic that we were addressing before. I think it's such a good way to describe the shaman. And although the shaman itself as a term comes from a language of an era that today would be considered modern Russia, shamanistic experiences have been experienced throughout everywhere, literally from Africa through Europe, through Asia, through the Americas. And there is this, he's an anthropologist from Brazil, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. And he has done incredible studies and working with indigenous tribes in Brazil. And he got to a very deep understanding of Amerindian cosmologies. And he has a beautiful article that I highly recommend to everyone about the Ixis. And so what he explains about this understanding of Amerindian, you can call them societies, is that the shaman is the transspecies being, the one who doesn't get limited by their understanding of the human. In fact, in this tradition, the subject does not have to be human. The subject is the perspective of the experience of existence. And this is why Viveiros de Castro define Amerindian perspectivism. And if you are into epistemology, posthumanism can also be defined as a perspectivism. I addressed this in my first book, Philosophical Posthumanism. And so in Amerindian cosmologies, the subject is not human, doesn't have to be a big brain, doesn't have to speak English or Portuguese or some, or Mayan language, doesn't have to have a human language, doesn't have to have a biological embodiment, although it can. But in Amerindian cosmology, even spirits are considered having some type of embodiment that maybe is not perceived to our five senses. So there is really an opening of the existential experience. And in this sense, who is the subject? The subject is the location that is having an experience. Right now, for instance, the mediation of our laptops between our conversation, dear Manuel, is having an existential experience that can be not summarized through my own existential experience right now. Because in this lifetime, my body is biological, and you're too. But there is an experience that is going on, for instance, through the network that is connecting you and me right now, which is connected to us. So it's not completely separated, but cannot be exemplified in our experience of this moment. I'm breathing air. I have some water close to me if I need to drink. I am sitting. I am enjoying the sunlight because I am in New York City and it's still daytime. Well, for you is evening. So even your experience right now is different from mine, but these experiences are connected. So we can think of the existential unfolding as a flow, as a river, as an ocean, as a wave. So in that sense, I would say the shamanism is extremely important to posthumanism. And is really extremely important because it is at the core of all of our identities. Very young children can understand shamanism. But if you tell a very young child, who is Inanna, who is Christ, who is Mohammed, if they are very young, 1 year old, they're not going to understand you. You need to be trained in a specific tradition to understand those notions. For instance, Inanna would be ancient Mesopotamian religions. If you think of Christ, it would be Jesus would be the Christian tradition. If you think of Muhammad, would be the Islamic tradition. But if you take a child and you take a walk and you show them the stars and you let them just see the stars in silence, they will perceive something that the shamanistic tradition is very important. And it is the opening of the planet as a cosmic perception. At the core of all these shamanistic traditions was the understanding of the solstice. Think of these mega temples made of stones. So the child would perceive that. They will not be able to summarize your experience in words, maybe through sounds if they are very young, but they will look at the stars. They will look at the stars, and they will be most likely at awe, in complete silence. And they will share that moment with you. They will know what you're experiencing without any intellectualizing. So it is very important to understand that these traditions are part of who we are. They are part of our cultural DNAs. And we know that nature and culture is not separated. So it's part of our DNA. It is part of our memory, of our ancestral genetic memory as a species. So thank you so much, Jessica, for bringing this important question to all of us. And thank you so much, Manuel, for asking these important questions of our first block of questions connected to the book launch of The Art of Being Posthuman that has just come out 1 week ago. Thank you so much, Manuel, and thank you so much, everyone.
No, thank you, Francesca, for meditating with us on the sacred. Thanks to everyone watching. So join us. Our next video will be we'll be meditating with Francesca about the child.